Hi everyone, so welcome back. Um, and this one is about this video is about solving for angles, but in a slightly different way, because for this one, instead of assuming that the parallel lines are parallel, we're going to solve for the angle in order to make the lines parallel. I know that seems really convoluted and kind of confusing, but the good news is it's actually really similar and exactly the same to what we did in the last video. It's only that we're assuming now that they're not parallel and we want to make them parallel versus the opposite way around. So we already know, sorry, I shouldn't have scrolled down, but we already know all of this stuff, how to name the angles and whether they're equal or add to 180. And in this case, what we're going to do is kind of still name the angles as if the lines were parallel, and then solve for that angle or for the question mark or the X. And if we do it correctly, then those parallel lines will be parallel because of the way that we named them. So let's just go ahead and get started on the first example. On this first example, we have two lines U and V, and we want those two lines to be parallel. So in order to be parallel, what we're going to do is actually name these angles, assuming that they're parallel. And that goes back to the first video of the lesson. And that would tell us that these two angles are alternate exterior angles. And because I know they're alternate exterior angles, or I want them to be alternate exterior angles, then based on this above, then they have to be equal to each other, which means that if I want my lines to be parallel, then the question mark has to be equal to 70 degrees. And that's my answer. I realize that I'm probably making this a little bit more complicated than it needs to be because it's the exact same thing as we did in the last video, but I want you to be aware that potentially your lines don't have to be parallel, but we can make them parallel by doing the same thing as what we do for the parallel lines. And also, I just noticed that I misspelled alternate. Pretend like I'm good at spelling. Okay. All right, let's look at the second one. Same thing. So now we have these two lines U and V. We don't know if they're parallel, but we want to make them parallel. In order to do that, we're going to assume they're parallel. And if we assume they're parallel, then these two angles that we're dealing with, the 91 and the question mark, have to be consecutive interior angles. And because I know they're consecutive interior angles, that means I know they add to be 180. So I can say that 91 plus my question mark angle has to be equal to 180 if I want those lines to be parallel. To solve for the question mark, I'm going to subtract 91 from each side. The 91s cancel out over here, and we're just left with the question mark, and that is equal to 89. And so we know that in order for those lines to be parallel, the question mark has to be 89 degrees. All right, and then the last two examples, we're going to do the same thing, but instead of solving for a question mark, we're solving for X. So once again, if I want these two lines to be parallel, then I'm going to name them as if they were parallel, which means these are alternate interior angles, excuse me. Which means that I know that they should be equal to each other. So I'm going to write 28x minus 2 is equal to 82. And once I solve for x, that x will be what makes those two lines parallel. So to solve for x, I'm going to add 2 to each side, which gives me 28x is equal to 84 because the 2's cancel out over here. Then I'm going to divide each side by 28. And the 28 cancels out over here. We'll end up with x is equal to 3. So in order to make those lines U and V parallel, x has to be 3. All right, and then the last example, we're going to do the same thing. We have these two lines U and V. We want them to be parallel, so we're going to assume they're parallel first and name them. These ones are also consecutive interior. Which means that they add to be 180. So I'm going to say 19x minus 3 plus 8x minus 6 has to be equal to 180. And then we're going to combine like terms. So the 19x and the 8x would give me 27x. And then the minus 3 and the minus 6 would give me a negative 9. Has to be equal to 180. Now to solve for x, I'm going to add 9 to each side. The 9's cancel out over here. I'm left with 27x is equal to 189. Then we're going to divide each side by 27. And we end up with 7. So the 27 cancel out over here. We get x is equal to 7. And so in order for the lines u and v to be parallel, x has to be 7. And so that is how we solve for angles, part 2.